This event happened to me when I was a child, when I was around 12 years old. I'm a 23-year-old male now, so a little over 10 years ago. It was one of those experiences that took time to get over and will always be floating around in the back of my head somewhere. I used to live in an apartment block with my mother, who was a single mom raising me on her own. The block of apartments we lived in consisted of, I would say, 16 apartments. 4 floors with 4 apartments each floor. We had other blocks of apartments next to ours, so there were kids around my own age that I used to hang around with and play with. A few of them lived in my block, a few kids from other blocks. It wasn't the best area we lived in, not shy of crime or your local drug addicts. We used to be your typical group of kids looking for adventures and also getting up to mischief. One day we decided to play Ding Dong Ditch and Knock Door Run. These are where you'd buzz people's intercoms to their apartments and say stupid things and then run. And everyone, I'm sure, knows what Knock Door Run is. In my apartment, I was on the ground floor, and our next door neighbor was very rarely seen and didn't really socialize with the other tenants on the block. All we knew was he was a man who lived alone and that he wasn't home all that often. It seemed that he worked nights, as he was rarely seen during the day. I remember my mother once saying that just because people are your neighbor, it doesn't mean you should trust them. And looking back on that, it is one piece of advice I will always remember. So, on that day when we decided to play these games, we had already pranked a few blocks. When the kids I was with had then decided we should play it on my block, I wasn't too thrilled as I didn't want to cause my mom any problems, but we played anyway, and I assumed people wouldn't know it was me anyway. The number they decided to pick first ended up being the apartment right next door to me. They buzzed it, and there was no answer. They decided to buzz it again. When the intercom came on, there was no one speaking through it for the first 15 seconds. Just weird, slow, heavy breathing. It was strange. Then, a deep, raspy voice said,
"Who is this?"
Like he was shocked to get somebody ringing his door. One of the kids I was with started saying some rude things like, "It's your mom," and calling him names. I know, childish, but we were only 12. The guy didn't reply. He just sat on the other end, breathing down the intercom before shutting it off. At this point, the guys thought it would be funny to go knock on his door. We entered the building. I was against this and told them not to, as I lived right next door to this guy and didn't want him knowing I had anything to do with it. But the guys really didn't listen and thought it was funny at the time. They knocked on the door as loud as they could before running away into the hallway, peeking around the corner to see if he answered. He didn't, so my one friend said it was mine and another boy's turn to knock on the door. I really didn't want to, but at that age, I felt the peer pressure and didn't want to look like a chicken. So as we slowly went back over to knock on the door, I stood back behind my friend as we reached out to knock it. But before he could press his knuckles on the door, it shuddered loudly as if somebody was banging on it from the other side. It scared us, sending us flying back in shock. We then heard from the other side the chain lock begin to unlatch. As the door started to open, not wanting to be seen, we ran away as fast as we could. I looked back, and as I did, I could see through the small crack of the door an eye peering out at us. We sprinted back down the corridor and out front, but as we stood outside, we heard a noise. The intercom was still on, and what sounded like the same deep, heavy breathing turned out to be the man again, who then scared the crap out of us as he began speaking.
"So you were my mom, were you? You want to play games, do you? Well, maybe I'll play games with your mothers and take you away from them so they never see you again."
At this, we instantly ran, freaked out, and stopped playing for the rest of the day. I was afraid to go back to my apartment as I lived next door to this man. I didn't want to tell my mom as I was afraid of getting into trouble and told off for disturbing people. So later that afternoon, when I got home from playing with my friends, I buzzed my mom and ran straight to my door so I wasn't standing in the hallway for the man to see. That night is what freaked me out the most. I was lying in bed when I began to hear knocking on my bedroom wall. I was confused as to what it was until I was overcome with fear. As the knocking stopped, I heard the deep, muffled voice.
Can you hear me? I hope so. It was pretty stupid to knock on my door when you live right next to me. I know your room's behind this thin wall. Little boys shouldn't play games they can't handle. I'd stay awake tonight. You never know who might be in your room.
As I mentioned before, I was on the ground floor, and the layouts of the apartments were all the same, so for someone to know where my room was situated would be pretty easy to work out. Plus, being on the ground floor, anyone could easily look through my window. After I had heard the man speaking to me through the wall, I was overcome with fear from what he had said. Even if he was just trying to scare me, I didn't know if he was telling the truth. I know, I should have told my mom, but I didn't. I didn't want her to be mad at me. The night passed and nothing else happened that night. I didn't really sleep as I was scared from what he had said, but seems nothing had happened. The next day I calmed down and thought maybe he just wanted to scare me, so I never did it again, and it worked. I was never going to do it again. But then the following night came, and as I was lying in my bed this time, I was asleep though, because I woke up, all startled to the sound of screeching. As I sat up to see what the noise was, it sounded like my window was being shimmied and pulled up. As I looked, my body started to shake with fear, uncontrollably. Hanging half through my bedroom window was half a man's body as he crawled his way into my room. I screamed, louder than I think I have ever screamed in my entire life, for the man to shoot around and stare at me with his terrifying eyes. It was him. The guy from next door. My mom's voice from outside must have scared him as he began to climb back out the window. She burst in my room asking what was wrong. By this time, he'd crawled back out. I cried hysterically, telling her what had happened, and that the man next door broke into my room. She headed straight next door, banging on his door, not caring who else heard, but he never answered. She called the police and they dispatched officers. When they knocked, no one answered. The guy was clearly not there. When they managed to get in, the apartment was a mess, but it was bare. Hardly any property was there. It was found it was clearly being used as a drug den. After getting in touch with the landlord and gathering the necessary information on the man, it turned out that the information wasn't real. A fake alias, as he was probably working as a drug dealer or for a drug dealer. After that traumatic night, my mother soon moved us out of there to another location, and I never saw that man again. If I had not woken up, I may have never seen my mother again, just like he'd promised on the intercom. I know I was young at the time, but you really do have to be careful when playing games. You just don't know who you could be messing with. I'm a male, 25, who lives by myself in an apartment complex in my city, Detroit. The area I live in, to be honest, is not the best. It's a rough neighborhood, and crime is pretty high with the wrong type of people around. But my current living situation is due to change after this incident happened to me not long ago. I'm not usually home a lot, with either work or going out to see friends. But I recently found myself staying in a bit more than I usually would like. The reason for that is doing some online courses to try to get into the job field I want to do. I'm pretty much on my laptop most evenings, and I'm a chilled out, laid back kind of guy. I was studying one of my courses late one evening when there was a loud bang on my door. It was around midnight, so I thought it was strange as I wasn't expecting anybody to drop by. Anyway, I put my laptop aside and went to my door to see who it was. As I opened it slightly, I could see a man pacing outside my door, who I noticed as the guy who had recently moved in next door to me. He'd been there about a week, so I opened the door more, asking him if he was okay and what was up. When he acknowledged me, he stopped pacing and stared directly at me with a blank expression for about a good 30 seconds, which I found weird When I again was about to ask him why he had knocked on, he suddenly spoke, cutting me off. He banged his hand, resting it on my door as he leaned in towards me, saying,
"You need to be quiet in there. I can hear you moving and being loud. It's pissing me off."
Taken back by this, I said, "Excuse me?" I was confused as I was literally just sat in my apartment on my laptop. No TV, no music on, nothing that could remotely be considered loud.
"I can hear you, and if it continues, you won't want me coming back round again."
Stunned by this, as I'd only ever spoke to this guy once, saying, "Hey," when he moved in, but from looking at him now and his actions, I could tell he was on something. I said, "Look, I don't know what you're on about. It can't be me. I'm just about to go to sleep, okay? So you won't be hearing anything anyway, and if you do, it's not me." Annoyed and confused by the sudden encounter, I said my piece and shut the door. As I did, I could hear the guy mumbling to himself outside as he walked back to his apartment and slammed the door. After that, I couldn't concentrate, as all I was thinking about was, what the hell was he on about? I hadn't been doing anything. So calling it a night, I packed my stuff away and headed to bed. Not long after I did, I again could hear this asshole talking aloud. And he followed that by banging on the wall between our apartments. What the hell was this guy's problem? I thought. I really wanted to bang back at the moment, but I'm not the most confrontational guy, and thought to myself, he's clearly on drugs, and he probably wouldn't remember this in the morning, even though that isn't an excuse, but I let it go. And sure enough, there was no more banging, and I managed to fall asleep without any more commotion that night. The next evening, when I returned from work, I was walking up my hallway, and as I was about to pass the guy's apartment, I slowly went past, listening to see if I could hear anything. But I couldn't. I was pretty sure he wasn't home. In the moment, I'd had in mind knocking on and talking about the night before, but I thought better of it. From seeing what kind of person he was, I didn't want to hassle and just hoped it was a one-off and it wouldn't happen again. I continued to my apartment to chill out for the night and do some more studying. Later that night, as I was finishing up on my laptop, tired from a long day, I decided it was time to get some sleep as I had an early start in the morning. As I was shutting down and listening to the end of a song through my headphones, I could hear the distinct sound of banging coming from my front door. The banging was aggressively hard, as I could feel the shutter of the door from where I was sitting. I pulled out my headphones and stared at the door, not quite believing it could be that guy again. Then, as I went to stand, 4 more loud bangs shuddered through the door. At this point, I'd had enough if it was him, which I assumed it was. What the hell was his problem now? I rushed to the door and opened it, and again, I come face to face with the guy next door, pacing outside of mine. At this point, I wasn't in the mood to take any shit, so in an annoyed tone, I said, "What?" The guy stopped pacing as he stood right in front of me, again, just staring for a while. I could clearly see his pupils were dilated, and I noticed his sweaty, graying skin.
"I can hear you again. What the fuck did I tell you about the noise and if I had to come back?"
He aggressively spat at me. The guy was crazy. I hadn't made any kind of noise all night. Frankly, at that point, I was angry with all the attitude and false accusations he was blaming me for. My adrenaline was beginning to pump as I knew I had to stand my ground. I said, "Listen, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I'm not making any noise, so you need to fuck off. And if you continue with your aggressive and threatening behavior, I'll call the cops, okay?" As I said what I said, nerves began to creep in as I saw the way the guy just started staring at me, how he looked like he hated me. I told him I was going and slowly began to shut my door. As I did, I heard him say,
"Oh, you'll be sorry."
His door slammed as he went back to his apartment. Kind of freaked out by what he meant by that. I made sure my door was locked, too. I headed to bed, thinking about what I was going to do if this continued, already dreading the next night. It didn't take me long to drift off that night, but I was soon woken to the sound of what sounded like a crashing sound coming from my apartment. Luckily, I'm a light sleeper and shot up to listen. I could hear movement in my apartment, the sound of somebody walking around. My heart began to race as I knew full well somebody was inside. As I was about to get up, I froze as footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. My door handle began to rotate as somebody tried to get in. The sound of the door unclicking sent a shiver down my spine as fear took over. As I mentioned, I live in a dodgy area, so I always sleep with a bat by my bed, and at that moment, I reached for it, gripping it tight. I stood up as my bedroom door creaked open, and as I turned the light on next to my bed, to my horror, it lit up my next door neighbor standing in my doorway. Not only standing there, but holding a knife. The hairs on my neck stood up as I screamed at him. What the hell was he doing? It was then he bellowed at me. He told me I'd be sorry, breaking out into a run as he lunged at me. Fearing for my life, I swung the bat before he could get any closer and made clean contact with his arm, knocking the knife out of his hand. Not wasting another second, I swung it again as it struck him on the side of the head, knocking him to the floor. He was knocked out. I ran out of my room as I grabbed the phone, calling the police, explaining to them what had happened. They arrived pretty soon as I waited outside my apartment, too afraid to go back inside, so I kept an eye on the door. They found the man where I had left him, in my room, still unconscious. When they got him to come around, they arrested him for breaking and entering with the intent to cause physical harm. The look in that man's eyes that night was filled with hatred. If I hadn't have woken up that night, I'm pretty sure he would have took my life as I slept. It was found he'd had a history of assault charges, and it had been in and out of prison on those and drug-related offenses. I'm currently looking for a new place to live, as after that night, I really don't feel safe in my own home or even living in that area anymore. Just a quick one, guys. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed these disturbing stories. Why don't you comment down below which one would have terrified you the most if it were you in that situation. Also, don't forget to subscribe just over to the left and look out for plenty more upcoming content by hitting that bell button. If you can, like, comment, and share. It really helps us out, and I really appreciate it a lot, you guys. Let us know what story subjects you'd be interested in hearing soon in upcoming videos. And thanks again. Take care out there, and remember, fear lies within.